Okay.
Have you heard about the South Korean president declaring martial law?
Oh yeah, yeah. That was quite a shock. I saw that yesterday morning. That was not something I was expecting, to be
Right.
honest.
So he declared martial law, and then what? Like 6 hours later, he said, "Just kidding," and everything's back to normal. So what
Yeah.
happened? Can you tell us?
Okay. Well, I haven't been following the things in South Korea really very closely. Really just when it intersects with the larger issues that we usually discuss. North Korea and Russia, the Ukraine war. Then I look at it, and so I've known that this president was a real neocon, and in sharp contrast to the previous president. The previous president, under the previous president, South Korea had very good relations with Russia, and he also that previous administration also sought to avoid conflict with North Korea and improve relations with China too. But this new president is very much in the neocon mold, and has been, so one of the things that we've mentioned earlier is that he actually uh, he made a decision to supply Ukraine, via the U.S. with hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. And this was clearly seen as a hostile act by Russia. It clearly was. And it may have contributed to Russia's decision to have to establish a full military alliance with North Korea. It was a stupid thing to do. It was one of these things. He just decided that he was going to make South Korea a vassal of um, of Western hegemony, and with predictable consequences. But that's uh, I think that's part of the reason that he's unpopular. That's the issues that we focus on. But domestic issues are always the most important thing. And I don't really know what the domestic issues were there in South Korea. But he was or is probably even more so now, a very unpopular president. He had an approval rating of just 25%. And the parliament was generally, opposed to his policies and was stonewalling his his proposed legislation. So he wasn't getting anything through. And also, apparently, there were some impeachment proceedings had been brought against him. I think it may have been for corruption related issues. I think his wife is suspected of having engaged in some kind of corruption. Um, so altogether, this guy was, he was very unpopular. He was being threatened with impeachment. His wife was, potentially could end up in jail. And so what does he do? He essentially launches a military coup. He declares martial law. Now, this has happened in the past in South Korea. Over the not in the recent past. That's why it's such a surprise. But if you go like 20 years in the past and earlier, it was South Korea went in and out of martial law on more than one occasion. This time it didn't work, and I think it was South Korea has changed, and this guy was very unpopular. If you're going to do something like that, make sure that you have a strong base of support, and I don't think he had it. So the parliament, took a vote, and it was something like 190-0 against his martial law decision. And, I guess the army was following his orders, but I think he may have suspected that he was losing control of this, and he wasn't going to, that the army at some point might refuse to follow his orders. And he realized that the game was up, and he abandoned he rescinded his orders, and now he is going to be, he's going to be impeached. I think there's no question he's going to be removed from office, and I think that's good for South Korea. I mean, that again, he's been, I think, a disastrous president. At least, again, on the foreign policy issues that I pay attention to.
So if he's impeached and a new president comes in to South Korea, will we see somebody that you think will not be a willing vassal of the United States, won't be a neocon, or will?
Yeah,
What I want to see is some real independence from these
right,
countries, and it's kind of surprising me. Why is it so difficult for countries to break away from U.S. hegemony? Because we see this
right,
all throughout Europe, right? Even Germany, the United States
yeah,
blows up its largest energy
right.
infrastructure
It's
pipeline, the Nord Stream
extraordinary, right?
2, and they just go along with it. All of Europe is the economy's in tatters. Everybody's upset. It doesn't seem like any of these countries are doing anything for in the interest of their own people. They're
Right.
doing it just at the behest of the United States. The United
Right.
States says you go, everybody's going down with us, and it seems like everybody's going along. You can say the same thing
Yeah.
for Japan,
Right.
South Korea, all of Europe, except for the exceptions of Slovakia and
And Hungary.
Hungary. Right.
Right.
Well, why is that? What is it that? What is the? How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, it's hard. I mean, I guess it's over time. The U.S. has worked to subjugate these countries. They're constantly applying pressure at different points, and it's so that they want to see friendly people in their institutions. They've subverted their the media in these countries. Like in Germany, I think it was revealed recently, and it was known earlier that like the CIA had connections with just virtually every German media outlet, which would explain why we're getting these ridiculous stories, for example, about the Ukrainian role in blowing up the pipeline. I think that's pure nonsense, but that's a story that the CIA is regularly feeding the German media. Um, Even so, you could say, well, why can't we just have, a leader somewhere just say, no, it's not like the U.S. is actually going to invade. And if you had a leader that pointed out, revealed that the U.S. had, allowed a fair investigation to go forward and revealed that the U.S. had blown up the pipeline, the popular anger would be so great that I don't think that leader would have any problems, in defying the U.S. and steering a more independent course. Um, I think the reason is that their minds have been colonized. It's just like this neoconservative ideology has conquered their minds over the years. If you go back, not even too long ago, let's say the beginning of the Iraq War, during the months prior to Iraq War. Well, we had countries in Europe that were independent, like France at that time. France prided itself for decades of being independent. They weren't actually a part of NATO until I don't know exactly when it happened, but for a long time they weren't. They pursued an independent foreign policy. And it was part of being French, and that was important to the French political class. But this neocon influence was always there. It was always being applied, and eventually it proved victorious. I can't explain why, again, because it's not in the interests of Europe. But that's what's happened. And so that these people cannot think, you know, um, uh, on their own, really. I mean, they're in the end, they have become vassals. It's in ideologically, in every aspect of the relationship. They've subordinated themselves to the U.S. and they don't seem to be able to look at the world in any different way. And I don't know like the history of what's happened in South Korea, but I imagine it's very similar. So again, the U.S. has managed to shape. A lot of times, I know this happens at the Taiwan, may very well in South Korea too. A lot of students go to the U.S. to pursue graduate students studies, and then during that time they kind of pick up American ideology, and I think that's you can see the results of that in Taiwan. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in South Korea as well.
So how does like the CIA or just the US control media across all these other different countries? Because you said that in Germany that basically they are just sort of fed stories by the CIA. I also
Uh-huh.
heard it's the same thing in places like Japan as well. They basically parrot the US position in the media.
Yeah.
So it's really surprising to me. Like how could you not have an independent media in your country
Right.
that you
Right.
just get someone just hands you something. I mean, that's not media anymore, right? And this is
Right.
part of the larger problem of just whole
Yeah.
distrust in all institutions now in the
Right.
West. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the same thing. We used to have a fairly independent media, that journalists prided themselves in being cynical, hard boiled and wanting to, expose corruption among the powerful. Often they actually came from the working classes, back then, like up through the 60s. Um, but that's changed. Now you have people that come out of elite institutions and and go from there into the New York Times, and it's all part of they identify with the ruling class. That's who they are. And I'm sure the same thing's happening in Europe.
Okay, so they just feel like they're part of this, the halls of power, they're close to it,
Yeah.
and the
Well, they
center
right.
is the United States, it's DC, it's the
Yeah.
Pentagon, it's the CIA, and it
Right.
just
It's
makes them
like,
feel good.
right.
I
They
mean,
think it's, yeah, the great and the good. That's part of it. It's kind of amazing when you look and you see the awful things that are done by these people. But they feel that, they are like the kingdom of good. They're the morally pure. They're, and that in a way kind of justifies everything they do. If maybe um, you know, uh, they may bend the rules here, lie about this, but it's all because they're the good people and they're defending the good empire. And we have to stick it to the bad people.
Mhm. Do you think that the majority of these problems that are arising in part of the, I guess we call it the U.S. Hegemonic umbrella, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, Australia, all these countries that are having economic woes, unrest, all the leaders are quite unpopular for the most part. Is
Yeah.
that all stemming from the fact that the U.S. hegemony is in decline and that we're trying to turn the screws and bend things to our will and it's not working? Is Do you believe
I think
that's the
that's a good,
problem?
that's no question, that's a big part of it. I mean, what Europe has made a very serious mistake, by simply, as this multipolar world, emerges, it makes, I think a rational person looking at that says, okay, this is an opportunity. We can now actually, establish relations with many different poles of power. And that gives us more room for maneuver. It makes us more independent and we can pursue our own interests more effectively. That's what a multipolar world allows you to do. But they chose not to. They chose to go running to the U.S. and then kind of just throw themselves on the, on the U.S.'s, well, just
Funeral pyre.
yeah, well, right. Yeah, I guess you could say that. But anyway, yeah, they've made themselves vassals of the U.S. Especially since the war, they're just utterly dependent. That's the choice that they made, was to simply, to ally themselves ever more firmly with the U.S. and simply to obey, all of the U.S.'s diktats. And so they've lost a lot of their sovereignty as a result, and they have lost these opportunities to build mutually beneficial relations with other countries in the world. It's like it's not just the U.S. Um, doesn't only pressure them to be hostile, and that's putting it mildly, to Russia. Again, as we can see, with disastrous economic consequences. But it's also pressuring them to be hostile to China.
Right.
And it just makes it's so that's going to be disastrous too. It already is. Um, none of these are to the benefit of Europe. And meanwhile, the U.S. is kind of making off as a bandit. As Europe goes down, a lot of their companies are going to the U.S. because the U.S. is offering them tax breaks, and the U.S. still has cheap energy. Europe doesn't. I mean, it's just it's I don't know, astoundingly stupid. I mean, it's really hard to believe sometimes that how stupid these people are. Um, you know, some of them, I guess, probably do have fairly high IQs, but they're still, I guess, just they're so blinded by this ideology that they just, they're incapable of making rational decisions.
Yeah, you think that's really what it is? Sometimes I'm thinking something more conspiratorial, like, or
Uh-huh.
do they have dirt on them,
Well,
or are
that
they like
happens. That's
threatening
that.
them?
Yeah, I doubt that they have dirt on all of them. They may have on some individuals, and that may be part of it. I mean, that's what intelligence agencies do. Um, and it may be part of how they corrupted these institutions over the years, but it's only part of it. I think these people, as they become true believers, I don't think there's any question about it.
Right. Well, in becoming true believers, they are becoming traitors to their own countries. They're
Hmm.
not helping their people. They have a duty to pursue policies that are in the interests of their people, their country. And if you just take a look at, if we just compare BRICS to the US led bloc, it's just night and day. And I think most people can see it, that they can see that, okay, this is the future, BRICS, the multipolar world, and everybody, why are we clinging on to this self-destructive evil empire,
Uh-huh.
essentially? I just don't get it.
Yeah. Well, of course, the people that within the West, the vast majority, unfortunately, don't see it. People outside the West see it very clearly, and they're just scratching their heads, or making their decisions to move away from the West and head towards BRICS. That's happening all over the world. But within the West, there's still, like, we've talked about it in many different ways. There's still this abiding faith in both the power and the goodness of the West. I mean, it's just like, that's for them, that's an eternal truth, and they just can't get their heads around that. That's just, it's not true. It never was true to the extent that they imagine it, but it's certainly a lot less true than it was, say, in the 1990s.
Mm. Do you think that, what's happened in South Korea, it's kind of exposing sort of this thin veil between democracy and authoritarianism? Because what's happening now, as the ship goes down, we've talked about
Um,
this, there are two paths that these countries can take. They can see if their democratic institutions are truly sound, and they can vote in
uh,
a new leader that actually represents the will of the people of the
right.
country, or that they'll go more locked down. And what we've seen a lot is lockdown. We've seen
Hmm.
Germany talking about banning the AfD. We saw
Yeah.
the national rally denied its position in the French government by this coalition between the
Right.
capitalists and the
Right.
socialists, the establishment.
Even though it won the elections, right.
Right. So do you think that what path do you think we're going to be seeing it taking? Is it going to continue to get more and more authoritarian, or do we think that these democratic institutions actually do have some meaning? Because it's crazy to me that in South Korea that it's supposed to be a democracy where a president
Hmm.
just says, okay, martial law, and then
Yeah.
obviously didn't work, but it just kind of, for me, just,
Yeah.
I think it woke up a lot of people in South Korea, like, whoa, what country do we live in, actually? They can't
Right.
just say, like, lock you down, or say you have to
Yeah.
do this, and obey us, and then the army
Uh-huh.
comes in. And I mean, the idea that Ukraine is a democracy, obviously, I think is pretty
Yeah.
much a
It's a
joke. I mean,
long, right.
Zelensky's term
Right.
expired a long time ago,
Right.
but
Yeah, and all the opposition parties were banned quite a long time, and it's important to point out that these anti-democratic trend started before the special military operation in 2022. Um, yeah, Ukraine is nowhere near a democratic society, and it hasn't been for a long time, and it's just absurd. It's held up as like, here's this bastion of democracy against evil authoritarian Russians, but we know that, and it's all about whose side you're on. Democracy is just an excuse. And obviously they're not interested in the substance of democracy. They just redefined democracy to mean, are you on our side, or not? That's and Georgia, for example, though they haven't been pro-Russian. Actually, they've been somewhat hostile to Russia. Over the last few years, they have not. They have refused to sanction Russia. They have refused to be, hostile in the way that the Europeans want them to be. And so
don't.
that's why their democracy is not democracy. The results of their election are unacceptable, and their president, who can't even speak Georgian but speaks French because that's where she was born and raised, is refusing to step down. So it's another example of in the name of democracy, I'm not going to listen to the will of the voters.